Good day. Thank you for joining us at the second, I think, panel for today's session for the Next System Convergence. My name is Matt Burke. I am based at the University of Vermont, and I am pleased to introduce my friend, colleague, and mentor in many ways, Jon Erickson, who serves as at the Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources, where Jon is a professor of sustainability science and policy and the Guns Institute for Environment Fellow, among many other titles that he may wear at any given moment if you can catch up with him. And Jon is here to speak to ecological economics broadly and perhaps his experience in coming to that field and sharing his insights and knowledge and learning with others over the years. So with that, I will pass it over to Jon, and thank you again for joining us. And Jon, thanks again for making some time today to offer this session.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you, Matt, and thank you to all the organizers, especially George Mason University and our colleagues there. It's nice to see some familiar names pop up in the chat here. Hi, Jeff, Dina, lots of folks here. Oh my God. Liza, great. Thank you for joining us. Yeah, so my charge is to sort of talk about ecological economics, which is a field that I've been involved with really since grad school, going back to the mid 1990s when the field was first kind of becoming a named professional thing. And I thought I'd start more personal though, because I've had this kind of weird, at times rocky, mostly relationship with the field of economics more broadly, the field that I was trained in. And the kind of tone I want to set here, especially thinking about next systems, right, is so much of the system that we're in, or the system that we want to go to, is about narrative. It's about worldview. It's about, we often use this fancy word, paradigm, right? How we think about the world. And economists like me have been trained in a certain way of thinking about the world. And it's that way that I feel like ecological economics has emerged to address, to tackle, to critique. And in my hopiest of hope moments, to somehow replace the current mindset with something new. I often remind myself, there's a great quote by John Maynard Keynes, who certainly was an architect of a last major shift in mindset in economics in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, especially coming out of the post-World War II era, where we shifted from a kind of laissez-faire, hands-off, let the market do its thing, to a more managed approach to the economy. And then kind of through my career, we've shifted in many ways back the other way, laissez-faire, hands-off, market fundamentalism. But it was Keynes who said that the ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, often wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. Practical men, hopefully nowadays we'd say humans or Homo sapiens, who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influences, are usually slaves of some defunct economist. And so that's kind of how I come to ecological economics, like as a worldview, right? How do we sort of build a way of studying the economy that is not antithetical to the study of society and culture, that's not antithetical to the study of ecology and earth systems? How do we sort of bring these things together? Another quote here to set the tone. It was, again, one of the architects of the last major shifts in mindset and economics, Margaret Thatcher, wrote, "Economics are the method. The object is to change the heart and soul." And, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan were certainly part of the shift, this so-called neoliberal turn back to a kind of economics of 1920s America. So my relationship with economics and my discovery of ecological economics, quite by accident, really, if I go way back, started in high school, believe it or not. I graduated from high school in 1987, what I sometimes refer to in my writing as the year of the gecko. 1987, one of the most popular movies was Wall Street with Michael Douglas, who played this character, Gordon Gekko, as some of you on this call might remember. And this famous greed is good speech, right? And my high school graduating class kind of, especially males in my high school graduating class, were kind of inoculated, infected by this idea that what's good for the person is good for society. What's good for the markets, what's good for society. That freedom is equated with kind of freedom of market choice. And books like Liar's Poker and the Wall Street Film and all of these sorts of things were part of a kind of turn to take some of our best and brightest and recruit them to Wall Street, into finance, into banking, and to glorify um, wealth and income and the pursuit of greed for anything as the kind of right way forward. And of course, this was a generation that produced, lifestyles of the rich and famous, and Donald Trump and everyone else that we see these days who are in power. So I went into school thinking I'd study economics because that's what people in my generation were doing, study economics, study business. And I was sort of inoculated in this greed is good culture, but I always, it was like the culture of my father. My father was this businessman and he was like, I was like, I don't know what I want to study in school. He said, study economics, study business, you'll get a job. And that's what a lot of us did. But I always had this unease because I was my intellectual curiosity was always in ecology and biology and chemistry and earth systems, being outdoors, getting my hands dirty. I always found it's just so funny that how I learned economics was completely separate from my science classes, or separate from my social science classes, or separate from my humanities classes. And I always was kind of in search of this bringing together, especially of economics and environment. So in grad school at Cornell University, I discovered natural resource economics, like how do we efficiently manage the Earth's natural resources for human use, and environmental economics. How do we efficiently manage the waste that the economic system produces in a more sustainable way that fits within the carrying capacity of the Earth? But I was like, okay, here's the bridge, environmental economics, resource economics. But I still was kind of unsettled because it was very much the study of the environment, the study of natural resources framed as an economic use with economic value. Environmental economics, natural resource economics, as I learned in grad school, were kind of sub-disciplines of this larger economic worldview that I was still railing against, struggling with as someone of my age and of my upbringing. And then I came across I could be able to see this book. Oh, here we go. You can't see it with the fade in, fade out thing. I came across this book in a free book pile by Herman Daly, who I accidentally discovered was one of the kind of leading thinkers in the formation of what we now call ecological economics. And then the title of the book was Economics, Ecology, Ethics. And I was taking classes that semester, one in ecology, one in ethics, and one in economics. I was having this crisis, like how can these classes on this campus be talking about the same world, but from such dramatically different starting points, from different mindsets, from different paradigms? And I discovered that ecological economics was wrestling with this, right? How to rethink the economic system, how to better align the economic system with supporting social and cultural systems, how to connect them to sustaining and containing ecological systems. And as a young man in my early 20s, I discovered ecological economics and I haven't turned back since. But then ecological economics took a funny turn on me. It became kind of popularized that ecological economics was kind of like how I learned in grad school. How do we put economic value on nature? And so I saw some splintering and splits within the field of ecological economics. I thought I was signing up for a kind of new revolutionary view of the economy and its purpose. And it was starting to get sort of pulled into this more evolutionary view, right? Of, oh, just tweak the rules of the game, but the economic values can still run things. Greed is still good, but now we want greed for a clean environment, greed for natural resources, greed for biodiversity. And I was still struggling with this sort of divergence of values. So I come into ecological economics very much from a next systems point of view. I discovered this kind of merging of ethics, ecology, and economics. It's a way to rethink our economic pursuits, rethink how we study the economic system, rethink how we sort of train economists and ultimately have economic policy. So what I discovered in the work of Herman Daly and Donella Meadows and some of the students of even John Maynard Keynes, like Joan Robinson, I discovered a study of the economy as a physical system. I discovered the study of the economy as ecosystem, a system designed by humans, but still nevertheless embedded in social and ecological systems, right? Not as value as produced in markets through exchange, but value produced by labor applied to land with capital. I kind of rediscovered a kind of economics that we call nowadays in the history of economic thought classical economics. It harkened back to the 1700s, the 1800s, when economists didn't call themselves economists. They actually were moral philosophers. Folks like Adam Smith was a moral philosopher, not an economist per se. I also discovered in this sort of new path of ecological economics that economies are things that are designed by people in power, right? They're not a natural outcome of like, evolution by natural selection. They are an expression always and everywhere of society's values. And I think this is a really important thing for thinking about next systems. If economics, how it's taught, is economics as its practice and is how we think about economic systems, always and everywhere, is an expression of human values, that gives us a really interesting starting point for thinking about next systems. I discovered in ecological economics the influence, for example, of Karl Polanyi, who wrote in the 1950, he wrote The Great Transformation. And at that time, coming out of the Great Depression, coming out of the World War II economy, Karl Polanyi wrote about the idea of a market society, where human society becomes an accessory to the economic system. And Karl Polanyi kind of pushing back on that notion of the market society, right? Not an economy in service of society, but society in service of the economy. And boy, does that ring true today, at least to me. I also discovered on this sort of journey of building and thinking about an ecological economy, I discovered roots for a new economy, a new system, right? An economy based more on love, care, stewardship, reciprocity, and an economy less on extraction, exploitation, colonialism, dominion over the earth. So in these fields of like environmental economics, natural economics, they didn't quite let go of the kind of colonial mindset of an economics that came out of the Industrial Revolution. What I found in ecological economics was a yearning for an economics that was more relational. Again, of the human embedded in family, embedded in community, embedded in society, and ultimately embedded in ecosystems. And pushing back on this kind of either or narrative. You either have jobs or the environment. You can't have both, that kind of a thing. Turning back, for example, or I would say turning back the kind of neoliberal turn of the 70s and 80s, and even challenging the era of what one of my mentors, Richard Norgaard, calls the Econocene. So you've probably heard the narrative of the Anthropocene, a human-dominated geological epoch. The Econocene is a sort of market-dominated cultural epoch, right? The Econocene, especially since the neoliberal turn, has been defined by what Norgaard calls, and this harkens back to some of the writings of Lenin, actually, economism. Economism is the reduction of all social values to market logic. So I've resisted that urge within my field of ecological economics of reducing all social relations, and I would extend it to all ecological relations as well, to market logic. This is the kind of ecological economics that I've been in search of through 30 plus years. So in this journey, I've found that there are a number of illusions that were taught in economics classes that were taught to the million plus students of intro economics throughout higher education, for example, in Canada and the United States every year. And I just want to review 4 of those illusions with you and then talk about how we overturn them. One illusion that we've been addressing through ecological economics is what you might call the illusion of history, right? That what you learned in an economics class at Harvard or Yale or Princeton, the top econ programs, has been perfected, right? It's like we don't have to worry about history because the orthodox view is the maturation of economic thinking. We don't have to go back and sort of wonder about different approaches to economics, so-called heterodox approaches that sort of come from questioning power, questioning distribution, right? Approaches that come from questioning relational values between human of different classes or different backgrounds. The illusion of history really sort of views market fundamentalism as the maturation of the economic system and economic study. Yet what I have found in my own journey is that history is as important as ever, that we've all been here before, that so much of what I have to say in ecological economics is kind of old wine in a new bottle, and that perhaps the purpose of studying economics, to quote Joan Robinson, one of Keynes's famous students, the purpose of studying economics is not to acquire a set of ready-made answers to economic questions, but to learn how to avoid being deceived by economists. So I think through the study of economic history, there's a lot of deception that can be unraveled. The illusion of the individual is my second illusion. Economics, as taught, especially in our most elite program, is built on this notion of an isolated individual at a point in time. What Thorstein Veblen, who founded institutional economics back in the late 1800s, called a homogeneous globule of desire, right? A very, very narrow caricature of the purpose of the economic system to accelerate the individual. But what we find in modern science is there's no such thing as the individual. Everything from the atomic scale to the Earth scale to the universe is all about relations, about connections, about the overlap of items, right? And that a new economics, a new system built on a new economics should be about what Thomas Berry called the communion of subject, not the collection of objects. The illusion of choice, the illusion of choice. Economics as taught and practiced around the world is also built on the idea of choice at the margin, choice at the increment. What matters is the next choice. So what I learned in a PhD in economics, right, is that everything can be boiled down to the next choice, and that the golden rule is marginal benefits equals marginal cost. You should do an activity until the benefit of that next activity exactly equals the cost. Then you stop. Here's the problem. If everything is built on an architecture of individual choice at the margin, right? We get into what Alfred Kahn called in the 1960s, 1966, an economist at Cornell, my alma mater, called the tyranny of small decisions, right? Each individual choice, the next consumption choice, the next production choice, the next house, the next road, the next mall, the next wetland that's paved over, might make sense in the short term, counting the marginal benefits and the marginal costs. But when you add up all those incremental choices over time, they often result in a system, there's the system word, that none of the individual decision makers would have voted for, right? Market choice, incremental choice, results in these failures of creating cumulative decisions that we would not have voted for. We wouldn't have voted for climate change, biodiversity loss. We wouldn't have voted for failing schools, growing income inequality. We wouldn't have voted for these things as the individual choice makers. So a science built on individual marginal choice at its very root is flawed. And then the fourth one, which will tee up the discussion at 12:30, is the illusion of growth. So as you can imagine, in ecological economics, takes seriously the question of growth and asks always and everywhere, to quote Donella Meadows, growth for who, growth for what purpose, and growth for how long, and questions the logic of can we solve the problems of growth with more growth on a finite planet. So a lot of attention in ecological economics has been paid to this notion of uneconomic growth, right? If we really are sort of preaching this marginal benefit equals marginal cost rule, like apply it to the macro economy. We only apply it to the micro economy. And economics apply it to the macro economy. And maybe we'll realize that some people, some places, some communities, some countries are in an era of uneconomic growth, where the next unit of growth is creating more cost than benefits. Why would we do that? Because we don't count the costs and we concentrate the benefits. And hopefully those of you on this call know that story. So I have found in ecological economics, especially reclaiming the roots of ecological economics, pushing back against the kind of market fundamentalism that's creeped into ecological economics. I found a new story. I found a new economics. I found a new economy. To quote a famous architect of the neoclassical economic revolution, Paul Samuelson, who said, change happens in economics one funeral at a time. So change has been slow. And we probably have to see a lot more funerals to be really morbid about it, or at least retirements before we'll see change, especially amongst these so-called elite establishments that control the narrative. But in reframing our future in this way and unraveling these illusions, I think we're seeing the kind of economics emerge that's consistent with next systems thinking, that's based on the plurality of values. Again, economics is simply an expression of the values and power. We often don't say that in economic systems. I've learned a ton, for example, from the field of feminist economics, really understanding the root of economic decision making. You have to uncover who's in power and why. The plurality of values, people often quote the statistician George Box and say, yeah, how we study economics is a model. And in defense of models, people often say, hey, all models are wrong, some are useful. Maybe you've heard that quote before from George Box. All models are wrong, some are useful. If you remember anything from this talk, I think you have to add a third piece to that. All models are wrong, some are useful. Useful for whom, right? The economic model, this model that we teach to young people all across North America, Europe, all across the world, really, is useful for some people, not for others. In reframing our future, hopefully you get a sense that we come at this of like re-embedding the individual in relationship with family and community, in relationship with society and culture, in relationship with the environment. So this means that this reframing also has to take seriously institutional design, right? Just to assume that markets are this kind of pure thing and that the goal of market fundamentalism, to quote Grover Norquist, one of the architects of the conservative revolution in the United States, the goal being to sort of shrink government down to the size that we can drown it in a bathtub, which again is kind of an ongoing theme these days. We really have to think about the balancing act between the invisible hand. Markets can do cool things, but in relationship with the invisible foot, right? Society should be directing market outcomes, not the other way around. And the invisible handshake, right? A kind of economics that's consistent with our social and cultural norms, who we are as human beings. David Colander, an institutional economist at Middlebury College down the road from here, often talks about the dynamics of those forces of hand, foot, and handshake. I was taught that get rid of the foot, get rid of the handshake. It's just about the hand. It's just about the markets. Instead, we need comprehensive, long-term, maybe even bioregional planning. We need democracies that direct economic outcomes, not the other way around. And then the last thing is I'll say in reclaiming our future, plurality of values, the embedded human and more relational economics, leaning into institutional design, really thinking about who's in power and why. But then the fourth thing, which will tee up the next conversation, is building a post-growth economy. We are at a time when we need economics to help us orchestrate a just transition to a right-sized economy. We've asked the question, growth for whom? We have asked the question at times, growth for what purpose, but we almost never ask the question, growth for how long. And so, in a resource constrained, environmentally constrained, socially constrained economic system, we have to be thinking about orchestrating a race to the middle. Who's in an uneconomic growth phase? Who's still in an economic growth phase? How do we race to the middle? How do we rethink ownership, right? Is the goal to privatize every and all things, to privatize anything with a pulse? Or can we imagine a kind of world where private markets have a role, regulated private markets have a role, and the public has a role, the public sphere, public resources have a role? Um, how do we imagine the decentralization of power, right? To build a kind of economy where we all share in the costs and the benefits of economic outcomes. That's the kind of economics that I've spent my career on trying to think through and build. What will perhaps the relocalization of everything look like in a resource constrained, carbon constrained world, right? I mean, a lot of the kind of boots on the ground ecological economics is now taking serious look at what our relationship is with food, our relationship with water, our relationship with energy, and imagining that local economies, local communities are sort of trying to come into balance with their own food shed, their own watershed, even indeed their own energy shed. And finally, and this is very relevant with the trade wars going on, how do we kind of build peace and prosperity together through uncoerced exchange, right? Trade can still be a great thing. Internationalization can be a great thing. Exchange of ideas and thoughts and knowledge and labor and is it was a wonderful thing, but we have to do it recognizing who's in control of the strings of power that have created these kind of coerced exchanges versus uncoerced exchanges. Again, another theme that I hope resonates with the Next Systems movement. So Matt, I blabbered away for the whole time here. I don't think we had time for questions planned, but maybe I was wrong. And
No,
we
we
can plan to
didn't,
sort of
but
tee things up for the discussion in the next section, right? Okay.
that was fantastic, John. Thank you. And I really appreciate hearing again more about your story and how you position our thinking about the economy in kind of the cultural and social context out of which it has arisen and
Yeah.
continues to be reified. I really appreciate deconstructing what we think about the economy and thinking about the underlying myths that continue to drive that, and then your real instinct early on how do we integrate the social and the natural into this thing we call the economy, and perhaps in the context of next systems and opening space for thinking differently, practicing differently, a little more agency in
Yeah.
developing a more desirable and life-affirming economics.
Nice summary. So you could have just said all that and could have skipped my talk. That was perfect.
It was inspired.
Okay.